Welcome to Women Who Protect, a series within the Ontic Protective Intelligence podcast. In a profession largely dominated by men, we spotlight women working in a wide range of positions within security, protection, and law enforcement. We'll hear their stories, discuss their accomplishments, and get their advice for women and girls who may be interested in a career in protection or security. I'm Dr. Marisa Randazzo with Ontic's Center for Connected Intelligence. After nearly 3 decades of experience working in security and protection, first at the U.S. Secret Service, and then in the private sector, providing security guidance to corporations, educational institutions, and high-profile individuals, I know firsthand the immense value that women bring to this field, and I know the challenges that we face. I look forward to sharing the stories of women who protect and hope they inspire other women and girls to join our ranks. Now, on to the podcast. Katie Hall is a retired law enforcement officer with 21 years of experience, first working patrol, then as a detective and in digital forensics. She specialized in investigations into child exploitation, and she served on the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. Katie's conducted numerous presentations on the topics of recognizing, reporting, and preventing child sexual abuse, keeping kids safe online, child forensic interviewing, and how to interview suspects with developmental delays. She also has private sector experience in executive protection and overseeing background investigations, intelligence investigations, and risk and crisis management. In her free time, Katie enjoys volunteering, hiking with her 2 dogs, finding fishing holes, tinkering with old trucks, and eating her way through new places. Katie, welcome to Women Who Protect.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning, because I just learned something about you a few minutes ago about how you even got into the field of law enforcement before getting into private security. And I want to go back to that. What were you planning to get into law enforcement all along? What did you major in? What was the very start of your career here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I went to college and I ended up with a degree in recreation management and wildlife biology, completely unrelated to this field. And when I first started college, I thought maybe I'd be a game warden, and there's some law enforcement component to that. And I remember going to meet with my advisor early on. Yeah, I was a freshman in college, and I was telling you that I think I had too much hairspray and too much makeup the day that I went to go meet with my advisor. Because when I went in and said, I'd like to be a game warden, he laughed me out of the room. And there's so few positions for game wardens that I think he was like, you need a backup plan. I was like, I don't need a backup plan. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it well. And, I think he just took one look at me and it wasn't sure I could do it. And so I put that dream on the back burner. And, I've always had a strong sense of justice, and I went about my career. I worked for the Forest Service. I worked for BLM. I worked for our state fish and game. And, I always ended up gravitating towards law enforcement. So the game wardens would ask me to come help with whatever project they had going. And it kept circling back to law enforcement. And it wasn't something that I wanted to do. And I always tell everybody, if you can't beat them, join them. And so when I was a kid, I wasn't interested in being a police officer. There was times where I was getting in trouble, but luckily, I never did anything so bad that it prevented me from being in law enforcement, but I'd never had a positive interaction with law enforcement. And so anyway, when I graduated college, I needed a job, and I was thinking I was going into firefighting, which law enforcement put me where I'm at today. And firefighting looked more interesting to me at the time. But the firefighters had a booth with the police officers. And so I ended up grabbing a packet from both of them. And I looked at the police packet and I was like, this is something I could do. And it keeps me in the town where I want to be. And so I went out and tested. And back then you had a run a mile and a half and touch your toes and do some sit-ups and push-ups. And I passed all those tests, and all of a sudden I was a police officer. And it was not what I expected. And one of the things, so that conversation with the advisor, the game warden situation, had always stuck in my mind. And so after I was a police officer for 5 years, invested in the system, I decided that I was going to apply to be a game warden just to see if it was something that I
Sure.
could do. And I did. And I made it through the process to the point where, I was having to consider whether or not this is actually a job that I'd take. And I just wanted to know that I could do it. And I did, and I could do it, and ended up deciding to stay where I was at. And at that time, I'd already done 5 years in patrol. I was moving into detectives, and I turned down the position as a game warden. But it was just important for me to know that I could do it, even though, so many years ago that guy took one look at that girl who was, in a sorority and probably wearing a lot of pink and high heels and was certain I wouldn't be able to do the job. And, ironically enough, I actually saw this man years and years later and went out to lunch with him because he and my dad had been friends. And I had
your
no
advisor
idea.
who had said, find a backup plan.
Yep. And I had a really pleasant lunch with him. He's a really nice man. And I think he was just being very pragmatic. And I took it so personally at the time. But, he was actually a delight to have lunch with. And I never did. I didn't tell him the story. I felt like maybe he didn't need to hear that. But I did tell him about my successful career in law enforcement. And if anything, I wanted to shift his mindset from maybe women, because at the time there was, in the state that I lived, there was 60 game wardens and only one was female.
Oh, wow.
And so it was important for me to tell him that I was in law enforcement. And although the department that I spent 21 years at was only, we were at about 15% law enforcement, 15% women in law enforcement, which is high for the national average. But I wanted to shift his mindset to let him know that there was somebody who looked like me, who could be in law enforcement, had done a successful career.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I love how you're describing it too, because you definitely got a reaction in part based on your appearance, and you had, the sorority girl and pink and the heels and all of that. And I think a lot of people, including women and young women and girls, think, well, to be in law enforcement, you have to look a certain way. You can't wear makeup and your hair always has to be back and you have to have sensible shoes. And maybe you have to do that if you're on patrol or working in executive, protection detail in a private capacity. But certainly in your off hours, you can wear as much pink and heels and makeup as you want. And
yes.
And I
absolutely
love the fact that you went back to your advisor to kind of let him know, like, hey, like, I made it successfully. And I especially love that you decided you still wanted to apply to see if you could be accepted as a game warden. And then you decided to stay where you were because you were starting to like the work, or you did like the work.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about what you then got to do within your law enforcement career, because you had a full career as a law enforcement officer doing a lot of interesting and, I would imagine, difficult work. So tell us a bit about the types of cases and investigations and work you got to do within law enforcement.
Well, I did, like I said, about 5 years in patrol and then applied for detectives. And, a lot of people that I talk to go into law enforcement and say, but I don't want to do patrol. I want to be a detective. And I think that patrol experience was so incredibly helpful and helped inform my investigations as a detective. And if you don't know, when you get this investigation, you're assigned a new case. And you wonder why maybe the officer left some stuff out, or this seems like kind of an incomplete start to a case. And then you realize, because that person, they were running from call to call that night. Maybe they were, this was at 3 a.m. And so they're writing this report at 6 a.m. and they're low resourced. And so I thought it was very important to have that patrol experience before going into detectives. And so I'm kind of a closet motorhead. In high school, I took all the auto tech. I know, again, like showing up probably in a lot of pink and real girly. And I've always had long, fluffy hair. So I went into auto tech. And I took all the auto tech courses I could in high school. And I worked at an auto parts store delivering auto parts. And then actually for a time after college, as I was establishing my career in law enforcement, worked as a service writer at a car dealership. And I still to this day have old trucks that I fix up. So I'm currently working, for any of you motorheads out there, I'm currently working on a 67 K20, so a 3/4 ton 4-wheel drive truck. It's part of how I decompress outside of this job. So having worked in auto parts stores and working as a service writer and having so much interest in vehicles, I ended up working a lot of stolen car cases, and that became kind of my interest. And actually, after they started assigning me a new type of cases, that was when my sergeant saw that I'd had too much of the person's crimes. He would actually say, "Hey, Katie, here's a good stolen car case." I'm like, "Yes." Like, what do we have here? And, be a stolen car ring. And it was my way to, again, decompress. But after working those stolen car cases for a while, we had somebody be promoted into another position. And the cases that they had been working as a detective were the child sex abuse cases. And nobody wanted those. And so I'm certain that somewhere behind closed doors, there was a rock, paper, scissors. And, somebody was Rochambeauing for who was going to give me the cases or give what detective cases. And I ended up getting all the child sex abuse cases. And I joke that I didn't even like kids. And so which actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise. I actually do adore children. But at the time I was young, I didn't have any kids, and I was being assigned to these really horrific cases that nobody else wanted to touch. And so I learned real quickly in my career that the answer is always yes. And so when your sergeant says, "Would you like to take these cases?" you just say yes. And so these child sex abuse cases kind of eat at your soul after a while. However, and any person who's worked these cases that's listening to this right now is going to know absolutely what I'm talking about. But it was actually a really good fit for me. And one of the questions that I would frequently get is, how do you not get burned out from investigating, one of the absolute worst crimes on this planet? And I saw it as little victory. So every time I got a case, it meant that some child felt strong enough to tell an adult about what happened and to trust that an adult who violated them is also good. There's other good adults out there, and they can tell an adult about what happened, and they trust that that adult's going to do the right thing. And so it was kind of a shift in mindset. And so being able to take these cases meant that I had the trust of a child. And so I worked those cases for 15 years. And the last 4 of those 15 years was specific to ICAC, Internet Crimes Against Children, and investigating child sexual abuse material. And in the meantime, there was the opportunities for promotion. I took the sergeant's test, but I really felt like my calling was these types of cases. And what it ended up doing, instead of promoting, is I ended up taking on smaller challenges, even if it was doing something like maybe rewriting a policy around something or rewriting a consent form. And maybe it was taking a training that nobody else wanted to take. And, these types of things, although they seemed like the reason why I was doing them at the time is because nobody else wanted to do them. And it was in some ways a little disheartening because I would have liked to have promoted, but promoting meant going back to the street, and it meant going back to night shift. And at that time, it just didn't fit in my life. And detectives do have some cushy hours. We've got banker's hours, daytime, we've got our evenings off. However, your nights are, you're susceptible to call out. You've got your call out weekends, whatever your case might be for your department. But I found that saying yes to these things that nobody else wanted to do, those things were exactly what went on my resume later when I went to go work in the private sector. And so just saying yes to the stuff that seems inconsequential at the time it became really important. And yeah, it led me to where I'm at today. And I've got I wanted to talk a little bit about my transition from law enforcement to the private sector. Again, it started with just saying yes. And we had a TV show come through town, and they needed people to work in uniform to block off streets. So it was an overtime shift. And of course, nobody wanted to do it because it was new and nobody knew what it was. And they were more comfortable with taking the overtime shifts they were familiar with. And so, of course, I always say yes. I said, sure, I'll do it. And so I go to block off my street, and I'm in uniform. I'm in a marked patrol car, and most of my career, the bulk of my career was in detective. So it was fun for me to get back into uniform to do these overtime shifts. And I end up being approached by this guy, and he looked official, and he had a badge on that, one that hung around his neck. And he started kind of quizzing me up about who I was and, what my background was. And I'm thinking, I'm just here to block the street. Like, don't you have something better to do?
Yep.
I could tell he was with the TV show. And he just kept quizzing me up. And finally, at some point, I started telling him about an interaction that I'd had years ago, because he was asking me about what I wanted to do when I retire. And with the department I was with, you could retire after 20 years. And I had this kind of formative discussion with this guy several years prior to that. I was at my parents' for, I think, 4th of July or something. We're at a cabin, and there was a campfire. And anytime you're a cop or in law enforcement or security, if there's somebody else at any gathering that you're at, they always say, "Hey, you should know this person. You should meet this person." Of course, at this
I've had that
barbecue.
experience.
Yes. If you don't already know them, you need to meet them.
Exactly.
So,
Right.
so I get introduced to this guy, and he's, at the time I was in my 30s, and this guy was, probably in his 60s, gray hair. And here comes this, I'm sure he was just, annoyed to have to be introduced to me, and like, here, she's a police officer. And
You guys have a lot in common. Go ahead, discuss.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, well, that's about the only thing we have in common. But just, my inquisitive nature, I started asking this guy questions as we're sitting around the campfire. And he was, I think, pretty dismissive of me. But I don't think he ever, I think I still have his phone number somewhere, because he actually did end up writing his name and number down for me. Like, little lady, if you ever need help, here you go. And what he told me was that he works for an organization that protects people who own football teams. And before we started the show, we were joking about some sports recently, and I know zero about sports. And we jokingly call them sports ball. If you know me, you know that I have no interest in sports. So I was thinking, this would be perfect for me. Protecting people who, and he said it was really hard to find women who were willing to protect women who own football teams. I was like, well, this is something I could do. And, I wasn't going to be distracted by, whatever football team it was, or, any of the glitz and glamour that goes with it, just because it, it fell on deaf ears with me. But I didn't even know that was a job, to protect people who own football teams. And this is what he did. And I couldn't even tell you the football team he worked for, because it meant nothing to me.
It meant nothing to you.
Yeah. But it planted a seed that there was life after law enforcement, and that you could take these skills that you were getting and do something else with them. So I'd kind of kept that in my back pocket. And so then fast forward a couple of years from that situation, I was helping with, we were doing a sting, child sexual abuse material sting.
Yep.
And we had a helicopter, so we weren't having to engage in pursuits. We'd have the helicopter, so if there was an incident and the person decided to run, we're not chasing them through town. We can just follow them in the helicopter. And so they put me who are they going to put in the helicopter? They're going to put Katie, who can talk to anyone. So they put me in the helicopter with these pilots for 2 days. And when I was during the conversation with one of the pilots, as we're, in between sting operations, I told him about this guy that I had met. And apparently there's these jobs where you can go protect women who own football teams. And I thought that was fascinating. And so he told me about a security firm. And he said, well, have you ever heard of this company? And I was like, well, no. And he said, well, they hire people to do that exact thing. And so again, I put it in my back pocket and I was like, okay, here's another bit of information about something I could do. And so I actually shot that company my resume in 2014. And I had a young child at home and a busy life, and it wasn't real feasible, but it was a step. And I was thinking maybe this firm could connect me with a job to protect women who own these football teams or something along those lines. Because what I found was that they were having a really hard time in the security industry finding women who are willing to step away from their family, step away from their lives, go follow someone else in their life. And I found that a lot of these ultra high net worth families were looking for women who blend in and, versus the big, tall, bald guy with the earpiece and the black suit. And they were looking for the soccer moms who could protect.
Yeah.
And that was exactly what I was.
We'll get back to the conversation in just a moment. But first, I want to tell you about ONTIC's Center for Connected Intelligence. In the world of safety, security, and protection, we know that sharing information is crucial. That's why we created the ONTIC Center for Connected Intelligence. The center is a hub for the ongoing exchange of security strategies and best practices, insights on current and past trends, and sharing valuable information through expert discussion and analysis. It's made up of subject matter experts with decades of experience across a wide range of disciplines. To find blogs, podcasts, webinars, white papers, and more, check out the center by visiting ontic.co/center. That's ontic.co/center.
So fast forward to this situation where I'm at this TV show, I'm blocking this road. There's this guy who's come up to me. He's asking me questions. And, he asked me about what I want to do in retirement. So I tell him about the story about the guy and the football team, and then tell him about the story about the guy in the helicopter. And he told me that I should, the guy in the helicopter told me about the security firm. Well, this guy who'd been talking to me for now 2 days at my patrol car, he kept showing up on day 2 of blocking the street. It was the most boring job you could have, but the fascinating part was talking to this guy. And so it turns out he works for the security firm, and at the time was actually doing the hiring for these types of positions. And it was just this serendipitous collision. And I said, well, I actually have heard of that security firm. I said, and in fact, I sent him a resume at one point, and I don't think he believed me because they're this renowned boutique security firm. So I actually, with modern technology, I was able to pull up on my phone and show that I sent this email in 2014. Yeah. So 6 years later, this is in 2020. So 6 years later, I said, actually, here's my resume. I sent it to him in 2014. And this guy's jaw dropped. He's like, well, you're exactly the type of person I'm looking for. When do you retire? It's like, I've got some time. So anyway, I ended up doing some 1099 contract work for this security firm. And they realized that I was also kind of a techie nerdy type. And so above and beyond looking at me for some of the executive protection, which is, I learned kind of just the fancy word for bodyguard.
Yep.
They started tapping me for some intelligence work and some investigative work, and COVID hit. And so this was all stuff that I could do from home. And so what I really wanted to do was the executive protection stuff because that was fun. There was travel. My child was older at this point. Now I could do this. But with COVID, we couldn't go anywhere or do anything. And so that came to a screeching halt. However, people still needed investigations done. And so they would shoot me some information and say, hey, could you deep dive this? And I was able to do these reports from home. And you know, I always said yes. Like I said, the answer is always yes. And so it got to the point where, the world started to open back up and they started to offer me some executive protection type work again. And I mean, there's so much to learn. From what I've heard, it's about 2 years of constant training before you really know what you're doing in executive protection.
Yes.
And so I was in the infancy of that journey when I actually ended up being assigned with the person who is now my boss. And so I do work for an executive office, and that connection was made on one of these times where, I had to move heaven and earth to get the time off work to go do this executive protection. But it was worth it because of the connections that I made and those relationships that I built. And, that's in the rest is history. So I did retire from law enforcement after 21 years and am currently working in the private sector. And one of the things, so in meeting with my current boss, I'd always kept my resume up to date just because that's just how I operate. But I realized that all those little things and I don't mean to make this about gender, but all those little things that maybe the men didn't want to do in my organization were the things that I could put on my resume and the things that made me stand out from the male applicants.
It's actually such an important point because these are things that you did instead of taking that promotion, right? Instead of you said you had taken the sergeant test, and that's sort of the natural progression for so many in law enforcement is you keep moving up the ranks. You want to go up to a higher rank, you test for a higher rank. It's assumed that promotion is always a good thing. And yet you said, look, I'm not doing the promotion angle. Instead, I'm taking on all these projects that no one else wants. But in doing so, you got to build a much broader base of experience and got to learn different tactics. Just rewriting policy, people, like, like, oh, you're writing policy. But yet policy is so absolutely critical in sort of executive protection, in any sort of private security, understanding how to read a policy, understanding when a policy is not working. It may sound boring, but it is a really critical skill to have. And so all these different things you got a chance to do, and you did in lieu of that kind of promotion that so many people would assume everyone would want it. Why wouldn't you want it? It feels like this was it gave you this incredible breadth of of experience that you now can bring to bear in your current position. And had you not, it didn't sound necessarily intentional at the time, but as you had shared with me earlier, you got a chance to do all this work no one else wanted to do, and in doing so, really put you head and shoulders above others.
Yeah, absolutely. I talked to girlfriends who are in law enforcement and even the men that I worked with, and saying, well, I was a cop for so long. How do those skills even translate into anything else? And, oftentimes folks go work at the federal courthouse doing security, or they go work for maybe a university, so doing law enforcement so their kids can go to college. And so it didn't really, there was really, there's no great plan out there that says, once you retire from law enforcement, this is how these crazy things that you did translate well into the next position. Because so many people, law enforcement offers you generally a pretty young retirement. And so I retired when I was 44, and that was after 21 years. And so, you want a second job. I'm not going to sit around for the next 20 years. I wanted to do something. And I find that with my colleagues, it was the same thing. They just weren't sure how that translates. And so a lot of this was learning what I did at the police department and how to translate that into private sector language. It's in the position that I'm in, I think it would take somebody with some sort of a law enforcement or military background to do the job that I'm doing. And to lightly touch on that, it's overseeing background investigations, intel investigations, and risk and crisis. And those are all things that, absolutely translate well from law enforcement. The other thing too, and I remember one of the first conversations I had with the man who I now work for, he said that he really liked cops because they were completely unflappable. He said, there is nothing I can say or do that's going to get you spun up. And I'm like, well, short of, a homicide, or somebody's deceased, like I feel like we can fix anything. And so much of my job has just been as a fixer and a problem solver. And that's just a skill that I think so many law enforcement take for granted. That's something that you do on a daily basis. And those skills that you learn, and whether or not you're a SWAT negotiator, every time you show up to a call, you're negotiating.
Right.
And you're having that conversation with somebody in crisis whose brain is disengaged from reality because what they're dealing with right then is the most important thing in their life. And this may be one of 20 different calls you're taking that day. But to be able to be present with that person, make them feel heard, gather the information that you need. That takes a skill set that so few other careers out there require, that it translates so nicely into this world.
The other piece I think that's important here, just as I'm hearing you describe it, and I know that this was true for me when I made a transition from law enforcement to the private sector, is that part of what you also need to be able to do is communicate effectively to those that you're now working with. Within law enforcement, there's there's chain of command, there's its own language at times, and you need to know that skill. But once you move into the private sector, you have to be able to put in a way to communicate what you were doing and why you were doing it to someone you're protecting or to a new organization that doesn't necessarily speak that language. And so to be able to just simply translate what it is that you were doing and why you were doing it, and to be able to communicate clearly and oftentimes plainly is a really important skill, and one that I think that making that transition, folks coming from law enforcement and from military don't often know how critical it is to be able to put into plainer language what it is that they're doing and why.
Right. Well, I'd say another one of the learning curves was so much communication in law enforcement and military is very blunt, direct, to the point when you're communicating with the people you work with. And so really having to work on those skills in the private sector. So that is not the way to communicate effectively amongst your peers. You can definitely pick out the folks who work in security in these organizations, because we do have just a different way of communicating. So that was probably one of the biggest learning curves for me is, maybe putting a beginning, middle, and end to my emails, with with the greetings and the pleasantries and the fluff. Making sure that I wasn't coming across as too blunt, too crass, keeping the sailor talk to a minimum, and not being as much of a bull in a china shop. So, that was probably one of the other skills translated nicely. And I'd say that's been one of the biggest learning curves is just how to operate with that background in a corporate situation and do it in a softer, kinder way.
Yeah. And to avoid the acronyms. Acronyms are huge in law enforcement and military. And so when you can actually spell something out, it's helpful.
Yeah. I literally had to explain BOLO yesterday in a meeting.
Yep.
And an IT person said, "What does BOLO mean?" I'm like, "That's a fantastic question." So yes, the acronyms.
I had a chance on is one of the episodes we do on Women Who Protect. I got a chance to talk with a good friend of mine who is in HR and now does a lot of work with security. And so she serves as that translator piece often between security or law enforcement and HR within her organization and others. And she was telling a funny story about hanging out for the first time with folks in security or law enforcement, sort of walking in different areas, and someone would say, "Hey, I've got your 6," and she'd be like, "Okay, I've got your 5," not knowing what "got your 6" means. I have your back, the position on the clock, and she's just wanted to get along and seemed like she was a team player. She's like, "All right, I got your 5," and they'd look at her like, "What?" So
that's fantastic.
So, one of the things that I found in making a transition from law enforcement to the private sector is that the tools that I had available to me to work cases in law enforcement were not necessarily available to me in the same capacity in the private sector. I'd love to hear your experience as you've made this transition now to doing private sector security. Do you get access to the same information? Have you had to get, more creative or scrappier? How do you look at for information for the investigations and the work that you're doing now in the private sector?
Yeah. So making that shift from law enforcement to private sector, I mean, that was, I had been doing some of that work um, through that security firm that I mentioned earlier. And so I understood some of the limitations in what I could get private versus government. And the biggest thing is, I don't have access to search warrants anymore. And so there would be bits of information that I would need it. And, I now have to form these relationships with law enforcement to be able to take my investigations a step further. So it might be something where we're looking at a person of interest, a POI, and we can only get so much information before we do need to, engage in that handshake with local law enforcement to take this over.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a little bit frustrating, because a lot of times we're going to be limited by their capacity to take on a new investigation and whether they see it as a worthwhile situation. And being former law enforcement has absolutely helped with that transition because I can call up law enforcement and I have instant credibility. In fact, there's a police department that I was trying to reach recently, and in regard to a POI, who was attempting approach to our principal, and I couldn't get anybody on the phone. So I went down to the police department. I could not find a front door. I was trying all the doors, and it was in a really sketchy part of this city. And I saw a couple officers, and they were walking into a door, and they were about half a block away. So I'm, shuffling down the street like, hey, stop. And I don't want to scare them. Just another. So I'm like, can I ask you a question? Just to get them to stop, because I was afraid that they were going to go inside. The door was going to shut behind them and I was never going to get access to this police department. And so I led with, because of course they square off with me. They don't know who I am. I'm just running at them, screaming like, stop. And I said, hey, I'm sorry. Former law enforcement, retired law enforcement. I am just, looking for the front door here. And they said, well, there is no front door because we're locked down. And, but just I needed to lead with that law enforcement piece to even get them to listen to me, because otherwise they would have just brushed me off. But being able to say, hey, look, I'm retired law enforcement. I appreciate what you're doing here. Thank you for your service. Can we connect? Whatever it is, however you throw it out there. But it gave me instant credibility with these officers. And then they took me right in through the side door. They connected me with their supervisor. And had I just been a civilian and had not had that law enforcement background, there's no way they would have brought me in through that door. There's no way that they would have put me right in touch with their sergeant. And so they do treat me differently because I'm law enforcement. However, once I get in there, I need to make sure that the information that they're providing me is something that I can have legally. And so it's kind of that dance and saying, hey, this is the information I need. I'm no longer law enforcement.
Yeah.
I understand that there's going to be barriers here. What can you share with me? Or where can you at least point me for this information? Because maybe they can say, well, we've got some publicly available information. We've got a public blotter, and it might be beneficial to look here. But yeah, it is crippling in a lot of ways. However, what I found in the private sector is all of a sudden there's money to pay for a lot of these programs, these kind of pay to play type situations, whether it's your LexisNexis or your TLO or OnTick. You then pay for these things and you have access to it. And so it's a matter of approaching the same problem from a different direction. And I would say just identifying those tools and going to these conferences and talking to other professionals and learning what they're doing and how they're accessing this information.
Well, and I think also as your own history has shown that you may make contacts along the way that become helpful years after you've actually made them. And so just the chance to introduce yourself to people, whether it's in conferences or that backyard barbecue around the campfire, whatever you had to do, that those connections may prove to be useful years after you actually make them. And you don't have to necessarily keep in touch as pen pals the whole time, but to just like that. It sounds like your experience has been so many people that you've met along the way, including going back to that advisor in college who said, look for a backup plan. I'm not sure game warden is it have proved to be useful in getting you to the career that you have today. It's been fascinating to listen to, and this wonderful image I have of you of the sorority girl with fluffy hair in pink and heels, having had this fascinating career, and you're really just only halfway through. So Katie, I can't thank you enough for joining me on Women Who Protect. It's been so fun, and I hate that we have to stop, and I would love to continue this conversation for hours on end, but I just want to thank you. This has been a wonderful experience.
Well, thanks for having me and letting me share this story.
This episode was brought to you by the ONTIC Center for Connected Intelligence. Learn more at ontic.co/center. Again, that's ontic.co/center. It was produced by AJ McKeon. Our music is a track called Roll the Dice and was written by Mark Wallach. Please remember to rate and review our podcast on iTunes and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have questions, we'd love to hear them. You can reach us at podcast@ontic.co or visit ontic.co/center for more information. I'm Dr. Marisa Randazzo. Thanks for listening.